So, this all started on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I had been lying on the couch, half asleep, just trying to enjoy the last bit of my weekend. My two boys, Alex and Sean, were off playing in their room, probably building some epic Lego city or whatever they're into these days. Janice, my wife, was in the kitchen chatting with her sister, Carla. I wasn't really paying attention to their conversation at first, just bits and pieces about some shopping trip or whatever women talk about. But then, Carla's voice got quieter, like she didn't want anyone else to hear. That's when I caught something that made my heart drop. She said, "So, how are things with Randy?" Randy. I knew that name. He was some guy Janice met during her annual work trips to Chicago. She'd mentioned him once or twice, just casually, like he was nobody special. But the way Carla asked? It wasn't casual. I froze, still pretending to be asleep, trying to make sense of what was happening. Janice hesitated before answering, which made it worse. She whispered back, "It's complicated. It's not like before." I stayed still, not moving a muscle. My mind was racing, but I had to hear more. Carla pressed on, "And what about Sean? Are you ever going to tell Jim? I mean, he deserves to know, right? He might not even be the father." And just like that, my world fell apart. I couldn't believe it. Sean. My youngest boy, the one I'd been raising like my own for 6 years now, might not even be mine. Janice had lied to me, hidden this huge thing from me all these years, and here I was, the fool who had no clue. I wanted to jump off the couch and confront them right then and there. But I didn't. I knew I had to stay calm, had to get more answers before I did anything drastic. I needed proof. I needed to know exactly what Janice had done. So I lay there, quietly fuming, as the conversation continued. Janice mumbled something about how she'd been trying to end things with Randy, but Carla didn't sound convinced. "Well, you better figure it out, Janice. It's only a matter of time before Jim finds out." Little did they know, I had already found out. I stayed on that couch for what felt like hours, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind was racing, connecting dots that I didn't want to connect. Janice and Randy? And Sean might be his? I couldn't believe what I'd just overheard. Janice must have wrapped up her conversation with Carla because I heard them moving around the kitchen, and then Carla left. Janice didn't even come into the living room after that, just headed upstairs like nothing happened, like she wasn't walking around with this huge lie hanging over our marriage. I sat up slowly, trying to act normal, though nothing felt normal anymore. I couldn't let Janice see anything was wrong, at least not yet. I had no idea how to even begin confronting her. Do I just come out and say, "Hey, I know you've been sleeping with some guy named Randy for years, and oh by the way, is Sean even mine?" That sounded insane. Instead, I made a plan. First thing I needed was advice. I wasn't thinking clearly, and I needed someone on my side. That's when I decided to call Jerry, my old college buddy and lawyer. We weren't super close these days, but I knew he'd help me if I needed it. That night, after putting the boys to bed, I texted Jerry and asked if we could meet up the next day. I didn't tell him why, just said it was urgent. Meanwhile, I tried to act normal around Janice. She didn't seem suspicious at all. Actually, she seemed relieved after her talk with Carla, like the weight of her lies wasn't pressing down on her anymore. But it was pressing down on me hard. I barely slept that night, running through all the possible scenarios in my head. What if Sean really wasn't mine? What if Janice had been lying about more than just Randy? What was I going to do? I didn't want to tear apart our family, but how could I just let this slide? The next day, I met Jerry at a small coffee shop on the other side of town. He sat down across from me, giving me that look like he knew something serious was up. "So what's going on, man?" he asked, leaning in. I sighed, not knowing where to start. "Jerry, I think Janice has been cheating on me." He raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. I went on, telling him everything I'd overheard the day before, the affair with Randy, the possibility that Sean wasn't even my son. By the time I was done, Jerry's face was a mix of shock and sympathy. "Jesus, Jim, that's rough," he finally said, taking a sip of his coffee. "But we need to be smart about this. You can't just go storming in there without solid proof. You need to protect yourself, especially if this thing blows up." I nodded. I knew he was right, but hearing it out loud made it even more real. What do I do? I mean, I'm not sure where to even start. Jerry leaned back, thinking. First things first, you need to gather evidence. If this goes to court, you'll need more than just what you overheard. And if you're serious about Sean, well, you might want to get a paternity test. That hit me like a punch to the gut. A paternity test. It was one thing to suspect, but having to actually confirm whether or not Sean was mine. I didn't even want to think about it. But Jerry was right. I needed to protect myself and the boys, no matter how painful it was. All right, I said quietly. I'll do it. But how do I even get that kind of test without Janice knowing? Jerry leaned forward, lowering his voice like we were planning a heist. There are ways to do it quietly, Jim. You can get a home paternity test kit. It's not court admissible, but it'll give you the answers you need. You can do it without Janice knowing. Swab Sean's cheek, send it in. Simple. I nodded, my stomach in knots. The idea of sneaking around like this, testing my own son behind his back. It felt wrong. But what was worse was the possibility that everything I knew about my family was a lie. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Jerry must have seen the doubt on my face. I know it sounds harsh, but you deserve to know, Jim. You've been raising that boy as your own. You've got a right to the truth. I took a deep breath and agreed. All right. I'll do it. We talked a little longer, Jerry giving me more advice on protecting my finances, making sure I had control over the accounts, and keeping an eye on any suspicious spending. I realized I had to treat this like a battle, like Janice might try to pull the rug out from under me if she knew I was onto her. When I left the coffee shop, I felt a weird mix of resolve and dread. Part of me wanted to just confront Janice, blow the whole thing wide open. But the smarter part of me knew that wasn't the way to go. I needed to be patient, gather proof, and make sure I had my bases covered before I made any moves. Back at home, Janice acted like everything was normal. She greeted me with a smile, asked how my day went, and went about her evening routine like nothing had changed. I watched her, trying to figure out how she could be so comfortable living this lie. How could she stand there, talking about dinner plans, while knowing she'd been unfaithful for years? I spent the next few days working on my plan. I ordered the paternity test kit online, had it shipped to work so Janice wouldn't see it. Meanwhile, I started checking our bank statements, looking for any signs of weird charges, hotels, trips, anything that could link her to Randy. There wasn't much, but I did notice a few gaps in her stories, like business trips that seemed to last longer than they should have. The puzzle pieces were slowly coming together. The hardest part was pretending everything was fine. Every time I looked at Sean, my heart ached. I loved that kid more than anything, but now, there was this doubt hanging over everything. What if he wasn't mine? What if this sweet boy I'd tucked in every night, played catch with, and taught to ride a bike was actually Randy's son? A week after my talk with Jerry, the paternity test kit arrived. I opened it in the bathroom, staring at the instructions, my hands shaking. I just needed to swab Sean's cheek, quick and easy. I'd wait until Janice wasn't around, maybe when she was at work, and get it done. That chance came sooner than I thought. One afternoon, Janice took Alex to a birthday party, leaving me and Sean at home. We were watching a movie, and I couldn't focus at all, knowing what I was about to do. My heart pounded in my chest as I went to grab the kit from the bathroom. When I came back into the living room, Sean was sprawled on the couch, completely engrossed in his cartoon. I sat next to him, trying to act casual. "Hey buddy," I said, my voice sounding too strained. "I need you to help me with something real quick, okay?" Sean didn't even look up from the TV. "Okay, Dad." I held up the swab, trying to keep my hands from shaking. "I just need to do this quick thing for, health reasons. Open your mouth for me, real quick." He glanced over, confused, but he did what I asked. Just like that, it was done. I sealed the sample and stashed it away, my heart still racing. I smiled at Sean, ruffled his hair. "Thanks, champ. You're all good." He grinned and went back to his cartoon, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. The next few days were torture. I'd mailed off the paternity test and was waiting for the results, but every time I looked at Sean, it ate away at me. Part of me felt guilty, guilty for doubting, guilty for testing. But I knew I had to get the truth. It was the only way I'd be able to move forward. Meanwhile, I kept digging. I started paying closer attention to Janice's behavior, trying to pick up on anything that might give her away. She had no idea what I'd overheard or that I was slowly piecing it all together. She still went about her days like nothing had changed, playing the part of the perfect wife and mother. But once you know someone's lying, you start seeing cracks in the facade. One night, after the boys were in bed, Janice was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. I casually asked her about her upcoming Chicago trip. She didn't flinch, didn't show any signs of guilt. Yeah, just the usual conference stuff. Shouldn't be more than a few days. I nodded, playing it cool. You sure you don't want me to come with you this time? I could take a few days off. She laughed softly. Jim, you'd be bored out of your mind. It's all work stuff, meetings and presentations. Besides, someone has to stay with the boys. There it was, the same excuse she'd been using for years. All this time, I'd trusted her, never thinking twice about it. Now it felt like a rehearsed lie, something she'd gotten good at saying to keep me off her trail. I kept the conversation light, but inside, I was boiling. She was still lying, still hiding everything. I felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner. Every trip to Chicago, every night she stayed late at work. How many of those nights had she been with Randy? The next morning, I called my brother-in-law Bob. He'd married Janice's sister, Carla, and we'd always been close. After hearing Carla's part in the conversation that day, I figured Bob might want to know what was going on in his own marriage. I didn't want to blow up his life, but I couldn't keep this to myself either. We met up for a beer that night, and after a little small talk, I came clean. Bob, I overheard something. Something you're not gonna want to hear. He frowned, setting down his drink. What do you mean? I took a deep breath and told him everything. How I overheard Janice and Carla talking, how Janice had been seeing Randy, and how Carla seemed to know all about it. His face went pale as I talked, like he couldn't believe what I was saying. When I finished, he sat there for a moment, staring at his beer. Carla's been acting weird lately, he said quietly. I noticed she's been spending a lot of time with friends and not saying much about where she's been. I never imagined she'd be. He stopped, shaking his head. Damn man. What do we do? That's when we decided to work together. Bob agreed to help me get more information, and in return, I'd help him figure out what Carla was up to. We had a plan now, find out the full extent of the lies before either of us made a move. The next few weeks were tense. I kept up the charade at home, pretending like everything was normal, even though I was dying inside. I noticed Bob was doing the same with Carla, playing the good husband while keeping his eyes open for any signs of her infidelity. Then one afternoon, the envelope arrived. The paternity test results. My hands shook as I opened it. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever was inside. But nothing could have prepared me for the truth. Sean wasn't mine. The room spun as I stared at the paper, the words blurring together. All the doubts, all the suspicions, they were real. Janice had cheated on me with Randy, and my sweet boy, the one I'd raised for 6 years, wasn't even mine. I didn't know whether to cry or scream. All I knew was that everything had just gotten a hell of a lot more complicated. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the test results. Sean wasn't mine. I read it over and over, like somehow the words would change if I looked long enough. But they didn't. It was right there in black and white. My son, the boy I'd raised and loved, wasn't biologically mine. I wasn't sure how to process it. I loved Sean. That didn't change. But now, every memory, every moment we'd shared, had a dark cloud hanging over it. He wasn't Randy's kid to me, he was my boy. But that didn't change what Janice had done, what she'd hidden from me for 6 years. I felt sick. I had to get out of the house before Janice or the boys saw me like this. Grabbing my keys, I drove around aimlessly, my mind racing. The betrayal hit like a truck. I couldn't shake the thought of Janice and Randy together, all the lies she'd told, how she'd looked me in the eye every day knowing the truth. I ended up at Jerry's office. I wasn't sure where else to go. He opened the door and took one look at my face before pulling me inside. "You got the results?" he asked. I nodded, handing him the envelope. He opened it and sighed when he saw what was inside. "I'm sorry, Jim. I know this is a lot." I sat down, running a hand through my hair. "What the hell do I do now, Jerry? How do I even confront her? I'm so angry, man. She lied to me for years. And now Sean. God, what do I tell him? What do I tell Alex?" Jerry leaned back in his chair, thinking. "You need to confront her, Jim. You can't keep this bottled up. But you also need to stay calm. Don't let your anger take over, because if this goes south, you're going to need to protect yourself, financially, legally, emotionally. I nodded, though I wasn't sure how I'd stay calm. The rage was boiling inside me, and I wasn't sure I'd be able to hold it in once I faced Janice. Take a day or two, collect your thoughts, and get everything in order before you confront her, Jerry said. And Jim, you need to think about Sean too. He's still your son, whether or not you're biologically related. That hit hard. Sean was innocent in all this. He had no idea what was happening, no clue that his world might be about to implode. The last thing I wanted was to hurt him. I left Jerry's office with my head spinning, but one thing was clear: I needed to confront Janice, and I needed to do it soon. The lies had gone on long enough. That night, I barely spoke to Janice. She didn't seem to notice, too caught up in her own world to realize something was off. I watched her, trying to figure out how she could keep this secret for so long without a hint of guilt. I wasn't sure if she was just a great liar or if she actually believed she'd gotten away with it all. The next day, I called Bob. He'd been doing some digging of his own, and it wasn't good news. He'd found out Carla had been meeting up with someone, some old friend she'd reconnected with online. They'd been sneaking around behind Bob's back for months. "Man, we're in the same boat," he said, his voice heavy with anger and disbelief. "I can't believe it's gotten this bad. Janice and Carla. They've been lying to us for God knows how long. We made a pact. We were going to confront them together. It wasn't just about the affairs anymore, it was about the years of deception, the families they'd put at risk. We were both hurt, both angry, and both ready to blow this wide open." 2 days later, the confrontation came. I waited until the boys were at school, and then I told Janice we needed to talk. The moment I said those words, I saw her expression change. She knew. She knew something was coming. I sat her down in the living room, the test results in my hand. I didn't even bother easing into it. "I know about Randy." Her face went pale. "Jim, Don't," I interrupted, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. "Just don't. I know about the affair, Janice. I know you've been seeing him on your trips to Chicago. I know you've been lying to me for years." She started to cry, covering her face with her hands. "I'm so sorry, Jim. I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake. It's over. I didn't." "Sean isn't mine," I said quietly, cutting through her excuses. "I did a paternity test. He's not my son, Janice." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't feel any sympathy. Not anymore. All I felt was a deep, burning anger. I waited for her to speak, to give me some kind of explanation, but nothing she said was going to fix this. "I was going to tell you," she whispered through her tears. I didn't know how." I shook my head. 6 years, Janice. You've had 6 years to tell me the truth." Janice sat there, crying, her hands shaking as she tried to speak. But every word out of her mouth just made me angrier. I didn't want excuses. I wanted answers. "You were going to tell me? Really? When, Janice? When Sean went off to college? Or maybe on our 20th anniversary?" She shook her head, her tears falling harder. "It wasn't like that. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was a mistake, Jim. I was confused, and I didn't know what to do." I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the wave of anger rising in my chest. "A mistake? You've been sleeping with Randy for years. And Sean, God, Janice, you've let me believe he was mine this whole time." She sobbed louder, but I wasn't sure if it was guilt or just the fear of getting caught. Either way, it didn't matter. She had destroyed our family, and no amount of tears was going to change that. "I love you, Jim," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I do. Please, don't throw everything away. We can work through this." I stared at her, stunned that she still thought there was something to save. "You threw everything away when you started lying to me." Her face crumpled, and for the first time in this entire mess, I saw real fear in her eyes. I stood up, the paternity test still in my hand. "I need time to figure this out, Janice. But one thing's clear, things will never be the same." After I walked out of that room, I didn't know what to do with myself. It was like everything I thought I knew had crumbled in an instant. I couldn't stay in the house. I needed air. So I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly around town, trying to clear my head, but no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the thoughts swirling in my mind. How had I missed this? All the signs I hadn't seen, or maybe didn't want to see, Janice's trips to Chicago, the late nights, the little lies that I brushed off because I trusted her. And now Sean. That was the part that gutted me the most. Sean, the boy I'd raised, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the one who called me Dad without a second thought. He wasn't mine, and I had no idea how to process that. I ended up parked in front of a quiet diner on the edge of town, just sitting there with my hands gripping the steering wheel, staring out at the neon lights flickering in the distance. I didn't go inside. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't anything. Just numb. That's when Bob called. His voice was tense, and I could tell right away that his confrontation with Carla had gone about as badly as mine with Janice. "Man, she's been lying to me for months," Bob said, his voice rough. "Meeting up with this guy, sneaking around behind my back. I can't believe it, Jim. I never thought she'd be capable of this." I could hear the same anger and confusion in his voice that I was feeling. We were both blindsided. Two guys who thought they had solid marriages, now standing in the wreckage of lies and betrayal. "What do we do?" he asked, sounding lost. I leaned back in my seat, staring up at the night sky. "I don't know, Bob. I really don't. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of it." We sat in silence for a minute, both of us trying to come to grips with the mess our lives had become. It felt surreal, like this couldn't actually be happening. But it was. "I guess the only thing we can do is get through it," I finally said, though I didn't feel much conviction in my words. Bob sighed. "Yeah, you're right. We've got to figure this out. For the kids, if nothing else." That hit home. The kids. They were the ones who would feel the impact of all this the most, and they had no idea what was coming. I couldn't even begin to imagine how I'd explain any of this to Alex and Sean. How do you tell your son that the life he's known might not be what he thinks it is? After hanging up with Bob, I drove home, feeling more drained than ever. When I got back, the house was quiet. Janice was in bed, and the boys were asleep. I stood in the doorway of Sean's room, watching him breathe peacefully, his little chest rising and falling. My heart ached knowing what the truth could do to him. How would he handle it? Would he even understand? I stayed there for a while, just watching him sleep, thinking about everything we'd been through together, all the moments that made me his dad, whether or not biology agreed. One thing was clear, I wasn't ready to let go of that. Not yet. The days after confronting Janice were brutal. She tried to act like everything could somehow be fixed, making dinners, being overly sweet, doing all the things she should have done before this mess. But it felt hollow. Every time I looked at her, all I could see were the lies. One evening, while she was picking up the boys' toys, I couldn't keep it in anymore. "Why'd you do it, Janice?" I asked, my voice low but sharp. She stopped, her back to me, then turned around slowly. "I don't know, Jim," she said, her voice shaking. "I made a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen." I stared at her, my anger bubbling up again. "This wasn't a one-time thing. You've been lying to me for years. About Randy, about Sean, everything." Tears started falling down her face. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was scared of losing you, of losing everything." I shook my head, my chest tightening. "You should have thought about that before you started all this." She broke down, sinking to the floor, sobbing into her hands. "I love you, Jim. Please, don't give up on us. We can fix this. We can try therapy, anything." I stood there, the weight of her words hanging between us. I didn't know if I had anything left to give. "You've broken something, Janice. I don't think we can just patch it up with a few therapy sessions." She cried harder, but I couldn't stay in that room anymore. I needed to get away from her, from the guilt and the mess. That night, I spent hours in the garage, trying to wrap my head around everything. The worst part was thinking about Sean. No matter what the test said, he was still my son. I'd raised him, loved him. He didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this. Sitting in the garage that night, I knew I couldn't keep living in this limbo. The house was filled with tension, the lies hanging over everything like a dark cloud. Every interaction with Janice felt forced, and the boys were starting to pick up on it. I could see it in Alex's eyes. He knew something was wrong. A few days later, Bob called. We hadn't talked much since our confrontations with Janice and Carla. He sounded exhausted, like he'd been through the ringer, which I'm sure he had. "Man, I'm thinking about moving out," Bob said, his voice heavy with frustration. "I can't keep living with Carla like this. She's still trying to act like it's no big deal, like we can just move past it. But I'm not sure I can." I could relate. Janice had been doing the same thing, acting like we could just go to therapy or sweep it under the rug. But I knew deep down that even if we tried, things wouldn't be the same. I hear you, I said, rubbing my forehead. Janice is doing the same thing. She's saying all the right things, but I don't think I can trust her again. And Sean. God, what do I even do about him? There was a long pause on the other end before Bob spoke again. He's still your son, Jim. Blood or not. That's the one thing that hasn't changed. That hit me hard. He was right. Sean had been my son since the day he was born. No paternity test could change the bond we had. It didn't matter who his biological father was. I'd been the one there for him all these years. Bob and I talked for a while longer, mostly about how we were both stuck in the same mess, and by the time we hung up, I knew I had to make a decision. The next morning, after I dropped the boys off at school, I came home and found Janice sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at her cup of coffee. She looked up when I walked in, her face pale, like she was bracing herself for whatever I was about to say. We need to talk, I said, sitting down across from her. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around her mug. Okay. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I've been thinking. A lot. About everything. And I can't just pretend like none of this happened. You broke my trust, Janice. And no matter how hard we try, I don't know if I'll ever get that back. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. She knew this was coming. But I've also been thinking about the boys. Especially Sean, I continued. He's innocent in all this. And I can't just walk away from him, no matter what the test says. He's my son. She broke down crying, her hands covering her face. I'm so sorry, Jim. I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know why I did it. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I don't know what happens next, Janice. But one thing's for sure, I'm going to be there for my boys. That's not going to change. We sat there in silence for a long time, both of us knowing that our marriage was hanging by a thread. Whether or not we could fix it didn't seem clear, but one thing was certain, I wasn't abandoning my kids, no matter how much pain this caused me. After that talk, the house felt even quieter than before. Janice kept her distance, like she was waiting for me to make the next move, but I didn't know what that move was. We were stuck in this limbo, where nothing was right but nothing was being resolved either. I wasn't ready to just forgive her, and she wasn't ready to face what she'd done beyond saying sorry 100 times. The only thing keeping me going was the boys. I tried to act normal around them, especially around Sean. He was still the same kid, still my little buddy who wanted me to play catch, wanted to sit next to me during dinner, still called me Dad without a second thought. One Saturday morning, after a sleepless night, I decided I couldn't wait anymore. I had to focus on what mattered, and that was making sure my kids were okay, especially Sean. I took him out for breakfast, just me and him, to the diner where we always went for pancakes. He was all smiles, talking a mile a minute about his favorite superheroes, what kind of birthday party he wanted, and how he wanted to be a police officer when he grew up. It was hard to hear all of that, knowing what I knew, but I kept a smile on my face and tried to stay present for him. As we sat there, I realized I had to make a decision about the future, not just for me but for the boys. It wasn't just about staying married or leaving, it was about stability, making sure they felt safe and loved, no matter what happened between Janice and me. Later that day, I called Jerry again. I needed to get things in order, legally speaking, just in case. I didn't want to rush into anything, but I also couldn't be unprepared. Jim, I know this is tough, Jerry said, after I filled him in on the latest. But you're doing the right thing, focusing on the boys. That's your priority. I'll start working on the paperwork to protect your assets, just in case things head toward a separation or divorce. Thanks, Jerry, I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. I don't want to mess this up. I don't want the boys to suffer more than they have to. You're a good dad, Jerry replied. That's the most important thing right now. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what the future might look like. Staying with Janice, trying to rebuild from all this. It seemed impossible. But leaving? Breaking up the boys' home? That wasn't easy either. I didn't know which way to turn. A few days later, Bob called again. His situation with Carla was spiraling. They'd been fighting constantly, and he told me he was pretty sure divorce was on the horizon for him. I'm done, Jim, he said, sounding defeated. She keeps making excuses, and I can't take it anymore. I'm gonna file for divorce. I just thought you should know. I sat there, silent for a moment. Yeah, I get it, Bob. You gotta do what's best for you. He sighed. What about you? What are you gonna do? I'm still figuring it out, I said quietly. But whatever happens, I'm staying for the boys. They're what matters. Bob agreed, and we talked for a while longer, both of us stuck in the wreckage of our marriages, trying to figure out how to move forward. I hung up, feeling the weight of it all crashing down on me again. No matter what I decided, things would never be the same. But one thing was clear, I had to keep going for the boys. They were all that mattered now. A few days after my conversation with Bob, I realized I couldn't keep putting things off. The weight of uncertainty was too much. The boys needed stability, and I had to make decisions for their sake, even if I wasn't ready to completely unravel my marriage. I wasn't sure what the future looked like with Janice, but I knew we couldn't keep living in this limbo forever. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, I sat down with Janice again. We need to talk about where we go from here, I said quietly. The boys deserve stability. I don't want them caught in the middle of all this tension. She looked at me, her face tired and drained. I know, she whispered. I'll do whatever it takes to keep our family together. I don't want to lose you, Jim. I don't want to lose what we've built. I sighed, rubbing my forehead. I don't know if we can fix what we had. There's too much damage. But we need to put the boys first. They need to know that we're both here for them, no matter what. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. I agree. I'll do whatever it takes for them. That night, I lay on the couch again, staring at the ceiling. It was the same routine, but something had shifted. At least now we were talking, both of us trying to figure out how to move forward. The thought of staying with Janice was hard to accept, but walking away and breaking up the family? That was hard too. Over the next few days, I worked with Jerry to start getting things in order. I wasn't ready to file for divorce yet, but I needed to protect myself financially, just in case. At the same time, I focused on being there for the boys. I took them out for more one-on-one time, trying to make sure they felt secure through all this chaos. Sean, especially, clung to me more than usual. And every time he called me Dad, I felt a mix of love and pain, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to let him or Alex down. No matter what happened with Janice, the boys were my priority. I would figure out the rest in time. As the days went by, the uneasy peace between Janice and me started to unravel. The weight of everything we hadn't dealt with, her betrayal, the years of lies, the uncertainty about our future, began to creep back in. We had agreed to focus on the boys, but underneath that agreement was the cold reality that our marriage might not survive. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the paperwork Jerry had sent over. It was basic financial stuff, setting up protection for my assets, in case we decided to separate. It felt surreal to be thinking about it like this, laying the groundwork for a life without Janice. As I flipped through the pages, Janice walked into the kitchen. She saw the papers and stopped in her tracks, her face pale. Are you preparing for a divorce?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. I didn't look up right away. "I don't know yet, Janice. But I need to protect myself. You can understand that, can't you?" She sat down across from me, her eyes filled with tears. "Jim, I'm sorry. I don't know how many times I can say it. I never meant for this to happen. I love you. I love our family." I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't angry. I was just tired. Tired of the excuses, the tears, the weight of trying to fix something I wasn't sure could be fixed. "I don't know if love is enough anymore, Janice," I said, my voice low. "You didn't just hurt me, you lied to me for years. About Randy, about Sean. That's not something you can just apologize for and move past." She wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "I know. I don't want to lose you." I sighed. "I don't want to lose everything we built either, but I don't know how to come back from this. Maybe in time, but right now? I don't see how." We sat there in silence for a long time. I could see she was struggling, trying to find a way to hold on to what we had left, but I was already halfway out the door in my mind. The next morning, I told Jerry to move forward with setting up the paperwork. I wasn't filing for divorce yet, but I needed to be ready if that was where things ended up. At the same time, I kept focusing on the boys, making sure they didn't feel the strain between Janice and me. Sean was still his cheerful, carefree self, and Alex seemed to be adapting, though I could tell he was starting to notice more. Janice and I kept up the routine for a while, trying to pretend everything was fine for the boys' sake, but deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. Weeks went by, and the cracks in our marriage kept getting wider. Janice and I were barely speaking, outside of talking about the boys or pretending everything was normal when they were around. It felt like we were both waiting for the inevitable, but neither of us was brave enough to make the first move. One night, after I'd come home from work, Janice was sitting in the living room, waiting for me. The boys were already in bed, and there was a tension in the air that I hadn't felt before. I could tell she had something to say, and it wasn't going to be easy. "Jim," she started, her voice trembling, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we stop pretending. I know you don't trust me anymore, and I understand why. Maybe we need a break, some time apart." I stared at her, feeling the weight of those words hit me like a ton of bricks. Part of me had been expecting this, but hearing it out loud made it real. "Is that what you want?" I asked, my voice steady, though inside I felt like I was standing on a ledge. She wiped her eyes and shook her head. "No, it's not what I want, Jim. But it's what I think we need. I've ruined everything, and I don't know how to fix it. I love you, but I don't think I can ask you to keep pretending this can work." For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger. Just a deep, heavy sadness. We had both tried, in our own ways, but too much had been broken. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. "Maybe some space is what we need." She broke down, sobbing into her hands. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't. We were too far gone. Instead, I just sat there, feeling the weight of everything we were about to lose. We talked through the details that night, agreeing that I'd stay at the house for the boys' sake, while Janice would move in with her sister for a while. It wasn't a permanent decision, but we both knew it was the beginning of the end. The next few days were hard. Janice packed her things, and I focused on making sure the boys didn't feel the upheaval. They didn't know the full story yet, just that Mom was going to stay with Aunt Carla for a bit. They didn't question it, but I knew Alex understood more than he let on. When Janice finally left, the house felt strangely empty, even with the boys running around. I sat in the quiet afterward, wondering how we'd gotten to this point, wondering what life was going to look like from here on out. It felt like the end of something huge, but at the same time, there was a small sense of relief, like I could finally breathe after holding my breath for months. No matter what, I knew one thing for sure: I was going to be there for Alex and Sean. They were all that mattered now. After Janice left, the house felt different. Quieter. Like some heavy weight had been lifted, even though the sadness still lingered. It wasn't the relief you feel after solving a problem. It was more like the relief of knowing the worst had already happened, and now, all that was left was to pick up the pieces. The boys took it surprisingly well, at least on the surface. Alex asked a few questions here and there, like when Mom would be back, but I could tell he sensed more than he let on. He was a smart kid, and I hated that he had to grow up so fast because of all this. Sean, though, was his usual happy self, unaware of the storm that had passed. I fell into a new routine. Taking care of the boys became my focus, making breakfast, getting them to school, helping with homework, and making sure they felt as secure as possible. I found myself trying harder, spending more time with them, maybe to make up for the fact that their world was changing. We went to the park more often, had movie nights, and I took Sean out for ice cream like we always used to. Those moments with them were what kept me grounded. One night, after the boys had gone to bed, Alex came downstairs. He stood in the doorway, hesitating for a moment before walking over to where I was sitting on the couch. "Dad," he said quietly, "is Mom coming back?" His question hit me hard. I'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it was coming, but I still wasn't ready. I patted the seat next to me, and he sat down. "I don't know, buddy," I said honestly. "Right now, your mom and I need some time apart to figure things out." He nodded, staring down at his hands. "Did she do something bad?" I sighed, not wanting to dump too much on him but also not wanting to lie. "It's complicated. Sometimes adults have problems that are hard to explain, and we don't always handle things the right way." He didn't say anything for a while, just sat there next to me, thinking. "Are we going to be okay?" he asked, his voice small. I put my arm around him, pulling him close. "Yeah, we're going to be okay. No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you and Sean. That's never going to change." He leaned into me, and we sat like that for a while, the weight of the moment heavy between us. In the weeks that followed, I found a strange sense of peace in the new normal. It wasn't what I'd planned for, and it wasn't easy, but there was a sense of clarity. The boys were my focus, and no matter what happened with Janice, I was going to make sure they had a stable, loving home. As for Janice, she called often, checking in on the boys and trying to stay connected. I didn't know what the future held for us, but for now, the space between us was necessary. There was too much hurt, too many lies, and we both needed time to heal. Whether that meant healing together or apart, only time would tell. Months passed, and the dust finally began to settle. Life had taken on a new rhythm, a quieter, simpler one. Janice was still living with Carla, and we hadn't made any decisions about the future yet. But as time went on, it became clear that things weren't going to go back to how they used to be. The boys had adjusted better than I expected. Alex was still a little quiet at times, but he didn't ask as many questions. He seemed to accept that this was the way things were now. Sean, being younger, just kept on being his cheerful self, always calling me Dad with that bright smile of his. That part hadn't changed, and I held on to it as tightly as I could. One afternoon, I took Sean to the park, just the two of us. We sat on the bench after he'd worn himself out running around. He looked up at me, his little face flushed from playing, and for a moment, everything felt normal, like the last few months hadn't happened. "Dad, you're the best," he said, grinning as he leaned into me. "Can we come here every day?" I smiled, ruffling his hair. "Maybe not every day, but as often as we can." In that moment, something clicked. Sean was my son, regardless of biology. It didn't matter what the paternity test said, he was mine in every way that counted. And I wasn't going to let Janice's mistakes take that away from either of us. Later that week, Janice and I met up to talk. It wasn't about us this time, but about the boys. We sat at a coffee shop, the awkward tension between us hanging in the air. "We need to figure out what happens next," she said quietly. "With us. With everything." I nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "Yeah. I've been thinking about it too. For now, I think it's best if we keep things as they are, separated. The boys are adjusting, and they need stability. That's what matters most." She looked sad but didn't argue. "I understand. I'm sorry, Jim. For everything." I nodded, not feeling the same anger I once did. "I know. But some things can't be undone. We just have to do our best for the boys now." In the weeks that followed, I made it official, we weren't getting back together. I didn't rush into divorce, but I started preparing for that chapter if it came. The focus now was on being the best father I could be and giving the boys a stable life. That was all I could control. I decided I wasn't going to remarry. The pain of Janice's betrayal had left a scar, and I wasn't interested in opening myself up like that again. But that didn't mean I was broken. I had my boys, and that was enough. I'd pour everything I had into raising them, making sure they grew up feeling loved and secure. In the end, I found peace not in fixing the past, but in building a future that was all about my kids. Alex and Sean were my priority now, and as long as I had them, I knew I'd be okay. The pain was still there, but it wasn't the center of my life anymore. My boys were. And that was all that mattered.